Well, following those April floods, there are growing calls for government to get rid of slums and build proper houses for the poor. Human Settlements Minister Mmamoloko Kubayi has been hosting the director of the United Nations Human Settlements Program, Maimunah Mohd, today. The visit trying to find solutions for the challenges of informal settlements and slums, which of course is not just a problem in South Africa but across the world. Kubayi led a tour of informal settlements that were severely affected by the floods. Our senior reporter Dessen Thathia following the story, joining us now in Durban. Dessen, thanks so much for joining us. So obviously the context here is that KwaZulu-Natal is under another weather warning. I wonder, before you tell us more about the minister and her meeting with the UN, if you could tell us about the weather situation currently. What are you hearing? I know that you're in touch with a lot of the emergency teams on the ground.
Well, Sally, I can tell you that they are on high alert, and I think ever since those April floods, it's almost been a very frequent state of alertness for many of these disaster teams. Others have used it as an opportunity to hone their skills. They've looked back at it and realized that they could do certain things better and they could respond in different ways as a result of that. So in many ways, right now, with that weather warning, and there have been a few since the April floods as well, once again, we find ourselves in a situation where teams are stationed across the province and they are ready to deal with any bad weather that may arise, and obviously the damage that is often caused in those situations. Fortunately, here in eThekwini, where we are now, there isn't any sign of that rain yet. It's particularly in those districts that you mentioned, but we will be keeping a close eye on that as well.
Thank you for that, Dessen. And of course, we know that the explosion at the substation just a day or so ago could possibly have been caused by a lightning strike. We're still waiting for clarity on that. But today, the Human Settlements Minister meeting with the UN Human Settlements Program head, going around the areas that were affected by the April floods. What did they say?
Well, we are in Reservoir Hills. This was the stop here in eThekwini, and it's almost become like a little template, a showpiece for the eThekwini municipality to show how it has responded to the issue of housing in the aftermath of the floods. So here on this plot of land, this was a vacant plot of land not so long ago, but now there are the first signs of construction that are taking place. This is where the municipality is planning to put up buildings, probably about 3 stories high from the pictures we've seen, which would house about 80 families. And those families, about 47 of them at least, are flood victims. The others will be the families that remained at the informal settlement where these particular flood victims came from. So the intention is to move them away from there, again speaking to that, the lessons that were learned from the floods and how these things now need to be done, because there's a lot of danger in living in low-lying areas. So that was one of the areas that was visited by that delegation before they came here to this construction site. And the initial response or the reaction is that they're saying that this would be now the way to go, to start looking at these proactive measures and start to get these things going. So to that end, UN Habitat is then going to partner with eThekwini, looking at offering its technical skills in dealing with the problem here. There is a massive housing backlog, and there is an MOU that has been signed with South Africa. So recently, Sal, you would remember that temporary student accommodation was being used, or rather temporary accommodation, which was student accommodation, was being used to house some of those flood victims. But that was also a bit of a mix-up, and there was a delay in that process. So I asked the minister about that and whether this was not something that should have been done all those months ago, and why are we only seeing it now. Let's listen to part of that interview that we conducted with the Human Settlements Minister a short while ago.
Remember, we've got policies, so our emergency policy yes spoke to the issue of provision of temporary units, and at that time you understand that we've not had the scale of the disasters in this nature. So you'd have had 100, you could build 100 temporary units, quickly move on. We've never had challenges. That's why we've never had to have an alternative like we are doing now. So that's the first thing. You would understand that we've been innovative along the process. If you remember, earlier before the April one, we had the January disasters in Pietermaritzburg area. What we utilized there, we utilized the voucher system to respond, because majority of the houses were partially damaged. Out of that, then we then changed our policy to say, okay, as part of the response for disasters now, we are going to include the voucher system for those who have partially damaged houses, and if their structural integrity is still fine in terms of the houses, then they can continue. Either it's their roofs, the windows they can replace, we give them the vouchers.
So you mentioned the housing backlog, which is already a problem, even before the April floods. And April floods obviously just worsened that backlog. But you also said that the UN Habitat is going to be working with eThekwini, which can only be, I would imagine, a good thing. Tell us a little bit more about how the UN gets involved.
So this is part of a broader slums clearance project. So now, as part of this tour, this didn't just happen here in eThekwini, but there were also visits to both the Western Cape as well as Gauteng as part of this initiative looking at the informal settlements there. So if we were to zoom in on eThekwini, for example, this is a major problem here, but it's not a unique problem. It's an issue of having people flocking to just one area. It becomes very saturated. As a result of that, there is no housing, and you find that these informal settlements tend to pop up. And then you have the issue of floods, because a lot of these informal settlements are now on land where formal housing hadn't been built for any particular reason, mostly because it's a floodplain or it's undesirable land. So with the UN coming in, they'll be looking at a broader plan of how this situation can be dealt with. One of the suggestions that we discussed with the executive director for UN Habitat was she was suggesting that there is more development on the periphery of these big centers like eThekwini. So what you'll find is, instead of people rushing here to get jobs, they would have jobs closer to where it is that they live. Let's listen to a bit of that interview that we conducted with her on this topic of slums clearance and dealing with the issue of informal settlements in cities.
We have to look into the housing supply and housing demand.
Yes.
And then from there we have to bring in the innovative solution, meaning that is in terms of the whether we can go high rise instead of low rise, like 3-story, maybe we can go higher, because this is also looking into the vertical development instead of horizontal. And then at the same time, we also have to look at the design of the house, because now people, after the COVID-19, they're looking into the new greener design, where we can more flexible, and also in terms of the material of the building material.
Yeah, because you know the poor need housing, and this has been a problem for many, many years. But with climate change, as we've seen with those April floods, Dessen, it has just exacerbated an existing problem. Let's hope that this partnership really does produce the homes that are so desperately needed. That's senior reporter Dessen Thathia in Durban.